Oh, the promise and the oath you swore have been painted red over my door.
Welcome to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast, where we explore the gospel that Jesus' earliest disciples heard and what the last several decades of historical studies have clarified about this first century Jewish message.
Listeners, welcome back to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. I'm Josh Hawkins, and as always, I'm here with Bill Schofield and with John Harrigan. Howdy, guys. What's going on?
Hey, man.
Living the dream.
Living the dream. How is that always a phrase on some of our episodes?
I don't know.
Oh, man. Listeners, it's great to be with you again today. We're continuing our look at the Tanakh here in our season 3 of our show. And last week, we spent some time looking at Isaiah. And we started to talk about Isaiah and how so many of the subjects that we see moving forward in the prophets revolve around the maintenance and the projection of God's covenant with Israel. And last week, we began to talk about Isaiah, how the themes of divine judgment and the day of the Lord and theophany gets projected forward through apocalyptic literature into the New Testament. Today, we want to continue our look at the book of Isaiah and focus on redemption, specifically the resurrection and the restoration of creation, two other major themes in apocalyptic literature, of how these two themes are pushed forward from Isaiah through the Second Temple period and into the New Testament, specifically in terms of how they're projected forward as God maintaining his covenant with Israel. And that's just a huge theme we want to continue to hit today. But specifically, we want to look at the theme of redemption in terms of resurrection and the new heavens and the new earth throughout the book of Isaiah.
Yeah, so the things that we're going to be talking about today out of Isaiah really begin to determine the Jewish narrative going forward. And the way you read the book, the way you read the Bible in general is largely determined by kind of your broad narrative of history, God, humanity, the future, the past, etc. And so the dominant narrative for most of Christian history is the Greek narrative or the Hellenistic narrative, which splits the universe into two parts. Rather than the heavens and the earth, you have a material and an immaterial or natural, supernatural later on. And the goal of redemptive history, the movement of redemptive history, is the escaping of the material world to an immaterial heavenly destiny. And the second major narrative within church history being the Roman narrative, that is kind of a modification of, it's that structure of the universe, but the goal of redemptive history is the progressive manifestation of divine sovereignty through the church, originally the Roman Empire with Constantine and the life of Constantine, but shifted to the Pope as the Vicar of Christ. And then after, that kind of holds dominant for 1,000 years, and then you have the rise of kind of the modern European narrative, which originally was a criticism of the Greek narrative, saying that there's not an immaterial world, there's just a material, a naturalistic world, and the driving movement of that narrative is human progressivism. I think of, it's a British narrative at its height, in which human beings are slowly, non-apocalyptically, non-cataclysmically progressing and getting better by means of technology. Of course, the Brits at that time are the height of evolution and the movement of humanity. And so whatever narrative of humans, God, and history you bring to the text, that's what you read into it. And so Isaiah really begins to define the Jewish narrative and the covenant between God and humanity in an increasingly apocalyptic manner, heading towards the great day of God and the resurrection, the new heavens and new earth, the resurrection of the dead, the restoration of Israel, kind of a climactic interpretation of Deuteronomy 30.
Yeah, guys. So as we begin to talk about the themes today from Isaiah that we want to look at, the resurrection, the new heavens and the new earth, we have to make sure, first of all, we understand them through a first century Jewish apocalyptic lens, as Jesus and the apostles did, rather than going, a new heavens and a new earth is just about the annihilation of the earth and sweeping away to an immaterial heaven, or God manifesting his divine sovereignty through the church in this age to make the earth awesome somehow in this age, or doing away with the supernatural or the immaterial altogether in the modern European, particularly, as you said, John, the British way of thinking about it. We want to think about the resurrection and the new heavens and the new earth in a Jewish apocalyptic way. And so with that, let's start looking at some passages from Isaiah here and see how this plays out practically in the book.
No offense to the Brits, even though you have a couple Irish guys here, but we love our British brothers.
So one of the things we're going to do today is we're going to be framing these passages in Isaiah about the resurrection in context to a new heaven, a new earth, because that's what Isaiah does. Like, Isaiah doesn't envision a resurrection apart from the heavens and the earth being recreated and restored. And likewise, and we're going to start here in Isaiah chapter 2, and this will kind of bring our second point into focus, which is the Lord also doesn't envision and he doesn't portray any hope for a restoration of the heavens and the earth outside of a restoration and glorification of the city of Jerusalem. And as we'll see, the only reason that is important to the restoration narrative, or not the only reason, but the reason that is crucial to the restoration narrative, is because of passages like Isaiah 2, like we're going to read right now, is because the whole restoration narrative, as it actually plays out with humanity and the other nations, it relies on the restoration of the city of Jerusalem. So let's look at Isaiah 2. We've read this before. I think we read it a number of times in season 1, because it does help to give kind of like a robust picture of how the redemption is envisioned. So starting in verse 1, or in verse 2, Isaiah 2, verse 2, "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the highest of the mountains and will be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations will flow to it. And many people will come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion will go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations, and he will decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, neither will they learn war anymore." And so the latter part, what it envisions, is obviously this complete reversal of the current order of the world, where the rule is greed and taking and war and fighting and killing people to get what I want, to where that's obviously not the case anymore, and no more will men learn war. But this only happens in context to the restoration and glorification of the city of Jerusalem. And this is a crucial theme moving forward in Isaiah and really in the prophets. But if you don't pick it up at the beginning, you almost get a temptation to kind of take these passages that are clearly geographic in nature. It's clearly just talking about a hill in the Middle East. And you want to spiritualize them in order to somehow manipulate the passages to talking about you. And usually what it ends up being is your contemporary circumstances, right? What you're going through right now. But what this envisions is so much more glorious than that. That's such a ripoff.
Yeah.
Wait, so you're saying that they're misquoting Isaiah 2 on the Isaiah wall outside the United Nations? I think that's heresy, Bill. Yeah, so, I mean, throughout the rest of the book, Zion and Jerusalem remain at the center of the projection of Israel's covenant and the maintenance of it into the future. And so when we begin to see passages about the new creation as a whole, Jerusalem remains at the center because Jerusalem is at the center of the covenant and the redemptive narrative of Israel. And so it really, the cry throughout the whole book is for the restoration of Jerusalem and Israel and creation as a whole, because it's the epicenter. So you really get that at the end in Isaiah 62, where it says, "For Zion's sake I will not keep silent, for Jerusalem's sake I will not be quiet, until her righteousness goes forth as brightness, and her salvation as a burning torch. On your walls, O Jerusalem, I've set watchmen day and night, they shall never be silent. You put the Lord in remembrance, take no rest, give him no rest, until he establishes Jerusalem and makes it a praise in the earth." And so the context of that is an apocalyptic context of Isaiah 2 and the day of the Lord, the humiliation of the arrogant, the rising up of the humble. Isaiah 13, Isaiah 24, the judgment of the earth and the heavens, and a new heavens and new earth with the glorification of Jerusalem, kind of the ultimate pushing forward of Deuteronomy 30 into the future. And this is the discipleship that's being played out. The call for discipleship is to cry out, "How long, O Lord, until you bring to pass what you've promised?" Ultimately, typified in Jerusalem being glorified.
Yeah, John, absolutely. I think it is so important that we see it this way. And so often I think we think about redemption and resurrection and the new heavens and the new earth apart from this, well, in many ways, here in the West, apart from a Jewish narrative altogether. And even when it is combined with the Jewish narrative, it's just kind of this random idea of like, oh, cool, like, it's the resurrection and the restoration of Jerusalem, but like as both you guys have been saying, it's some spiritual reality. It's some sort of realized thing that's happening now based on any of the narratives that you mentioned earlier, John. But I think this is so important to see that it brings us even all the way back to a passage like Genesis 12, where in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, we see God's calling of Abraham, and the whole point of God calling Abraham forth out from the nations, we talked about this in our episode on the Tower of Babel and the election of Abraham earlier this season, was God chose Abraham to be the vehicle of blessing for the rest of the nations and to bring the rest of the nations back to God, the blessing that's supposed to result in the nations in fellowship with God again, which harkens all the way back to the way that it was in the beginning in the garden, right? Yeah. So we can't disconnect the story of Israel from the new heavens and the new earth and the restoration of creation. This is the means by which God is going to bring about that very thing. And so, like you said, Bill, from Isaiah 2, the nations beating their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, we have to see it in context to, like what you mentioned in Isaiah 62 as well, John, the restoration of Jerusalem, God fulfilling his promises and covenant with Israel to be the vehicle of blessing for the rest of the nations. And what results when God does that? Global peace. This is where it's going.
That's right. And so, like when you hear us say over and over again, the covenant narrative or maintaining the covenant. So just go back, like Josh just brought up, go back to Genesis 12. What is the covenant again? Oh yeah, to bless you so that you can be a blessing to the families of the earth.
Yeah.
And so when he's talking about maintaining the covenant, when he's talking about glorifying Jerusalem, bless you so that the families of the earth can be blessed. So there's no need. I don't have to be in the center of every verse for God to love me. Right. It can really be about the glorification of a city in the Middle East, as that's God's expression for his love for me and my 47 children.
That's it. Well, let's move on to another passage, guys, where we can see what seems like a little bit more of a universal vision of the redemption, but it's also, like we saw in Isaiah 2 and Isaiah 62, this is still geographical. It still is linked with the city of Jerusalem. And this is the classic passages in Isaiah 25 and Isaiah 26.
Yeah. So starting in Isaiah 25, I'm sure we've read this many times before too in season 1, but it's too glorious. You can't read this enough.
Yeah.
So Isaiah 25, starting in verse 7, and he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all the people, the veil that is spread over all of the nations. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. So immediately, it's, all the people, all the nations, very kind of universal in its scope, and yet, where does he do it? He swallows it up on this mountain. He swallows up the veil covering up all the nations, which is death. He does it in context to the city of Jerusalem. And this is throughout the prophets. This is so central. And some of them, it's even more radical. But, Isaiah is really talking prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, but some of the prophets later on, as we get into them, we'll find to maintain this kind of conviction that Zion is going to be the epicenter of the redemption is quite a feat of faith. Yeah. We'll see later on in the prophets, but right here, Isaiah is constantly portraying, and is completely consistent throughout the entire book. This is the epicenter of redemption.
Yeah. I mean, you said this earlier on, maybe it was, I don't remember, maybe season 1 at some point, Bill, or maybe earlier here in season 3. But you made a point and you said eternal life has a postal code, right? Yeah, and the postal code is Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem.
Somebody actually heard that and randomly sent me the postal code of Jerusalem, just numbers.
Oh, that's awesome.
And I was like, what's that? And they were like, dude, it's Jerusalem's postal code.
That's awesome.
Okay, awesome.
That's awesome. The other point I'll make about Isaiah 25 before we look at 26 is, I mean, you mentioned this, Bill, and it's, he will swallow up verse 7 on this mountain, right? Like connect that just to the verses before in Isaiah 24. And how do we know what mountain he's talking about? Well, the Lord of hosts will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem. That's Isaiah 24, verse 23. Mm-hmm. And that just continues the same thought in Isaiah 25 on this mountain, right? So eternal life and the redemption has a postal code. In other words, what we've been talking about this whole time, this narrative that was set forth, the covenant that was promised, and how Israel is going to be the one who carries out their role to be a blessing to the rest of the nations.
9103401.
There it is, the postal code of Jerusalem. Love it. Well, I think the next chapter actually has some really important points that we can quickly take a look at as well. And it's Isaiah 26. And here in Isaiah 26, we can begin to see the ideas of the resurrection of the dead coming forth. And of course, this is still in context of the prophecy of the redemption of Jerusalem, the restoration of creation, the swallowing up death forever, and all of this. So this is verse 19 of chapter 26. Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy. For your dew is a dew of light. The earth will give birth to the dead. Clearly, sounds like resurrection, getting up out of your grave, bodies rising. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy. And so, yeah, we see themes of resurrection in the midst of this redemption and restoration of not just the city of Jerusalem, but from the city of Jerusalem reaching out to all the rest of the nations.
Yeah, and so, Second Temple literature, the resurrection of the dead becomes prominent in, the focus and language because the resurrection represents the hope of the glorification, the restoration of the covenant, the glorification of Israel, because the resurrection kind of embodies all of that. No pun, I guess pun intended.
Yeah.
And so you don't really get resurrection language anywhere other than Isaiah 26 and Daniel 12 in the prophetic literature, in the Tanakh at all. But it becomes prominent because it becomes a summary idea for a new creation as a whole within the covenantal context, within Israel's context. And so, for example, 4th Ezra 7 is a great example of kind of an extrapolation of Isaiah 26. And so it says, and the world shall be turned back to primeval silence for 7 days, verse 30. 4th Ezra 7, and as it was in the first beginnings, so that no one shall be left. And after 7 days, the world, which is not yet awake, shall be roused, and that which is corruptible shall perish. And the earth shall give up all those who are asleep in it, and the chambers shall give up the souls which have been committed to them. And of course, the chambers, that's the next verse in Isaiah 26, verse 20, where it says, "Go back, my people, enter your chambers and lock the doors behind you. Hide for a moment until my wrath passes over, for I will judge the earth for all of its wickedness," etc. And so the coming out of the chambers, of Sheol in the resurrection is kind of the idea that is being echoed in 4th Ezra 7, and it goes on, "And the Most High shall be revealed upon the seat of judgment, and compassion shall pass away, and patience shall be withdrawn. But judgment alone shall remain, truth shall stand, and faithfulness shall grow strong." So the whole idea of the day of the Lord, the great theophany, ushering in the new heavens and new earth, the new creation, is centered around this particular mountain in Jerusalem, Mount Zion, from Isaiah 24, in which death is swallowed up, and the raising up from Sheol happens, Isaiah 26.
Yeah.
It's good. It also, that passage there, also the language, I know we were talking about this earlier, but the interesting language there, that the concept of that which is corruptible will perish or pass away. And what's interesting about that is that which is corruptible was already going to pass away. So that's not a statement. Right. And so it's some sort of statement related to who inherits the world to come. You have to be incorruptible to inherit it, which, like we were talking about earlier, John, which is where is a possible source where Paul gets the idea that the perishable cannot inherit the imperishable. And so flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God.
Yeah, which is, the end of the cloud apocalypse, which we talked about before in 2 Baruch 73:74, where, "And it will happen after he has brought down everything which is in the world and has sat down in eternal peace on the throne of the kingdom. Then joy will be revealed and rest will appear. Then health will descend in dew and illness will vanish, and fear and tribulation and lamentation will pass away from among men, and joy will encompass the earth." And it goes on the next chapter, "For that time is the end of that which is corruptible and the beginning of that which is incorruptible." So the Isaianic kind of vision of the new heavens and new earth, which you don't really get in any of the other prophets, that language, you get ideas around it, but the specific language is very Isaianic. And so that, I think, is really kind of the base for the idea of the corruptible versus the incorruptible and the impossibility of corruption entering the age to come.
Yeah, it's good. And going into kind of elaborating more on the scope of the redemption, the book obviously kind of climaxes towards the end. And, we'll get a lot of this language later on in the book of Revelation. But if you don't know where it came from, then you take the book of Revelation and you over-universalize it, and you tend to make Jerusalem and the covenant the distant background that kind of serves to give some basic ideas and some language to the universal redemption that doesn't have any sort of geography or ethnicity attached to it. But
right.
But that's not the case. So going to Isaiah 65. So starting in verse 17, "For behold, I create a new earth, and the former things will not be remembered or come to mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in which I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem to be a joy, and her people to be a gladness. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. No more shall be heard in it the sound of weeping and the cry of distress." So again, what we have is it doesn't envision a new heaven and new earth ever without the city of Jerusalem being glorified and restored.
Yeah.
Right. And I like how you put that, Bill, where it's a switching of the foreground and the background. And so because we're conditioned in the Hellenistic narrative, we view the new heavens and new earth in Isaiah 65 as the foreground. And then everything after that is secondary, minor. Whereas for him, the new heavens and new earth are the background for the main thing, which is the New Jerusalem, representing the fixing of this relationship between God and Israel that then the nations come into relationship with, Absolutely. And I think, it's the Greek narrative that is really kind of, it's set the tone throughout church history that Isaiah 65 and Isaiah 66 are just, it's a immaterial, singular heavenly reality that is the new heavens and new earth, and the goal of redemptive history is getting to the immaterial heavenly destiny. And so that becomes, the New Jerusalem within that narrative is just, it's the eternal sing-along in the sky. It's the floating city in the sky. And so, that conditions kind of what is the primary reality of the narrative. Whereas for Isaiah, for, ancient readers, the primary reality of the narrative is Sinai and the covenant with the patriarchs that then, are in a corporate manner at Sinai, and then the maintenance of that covenant throughout Israel's history. Yeah. The point of Isaiah's projection of that vision of that relationship into the future, of course, is the glorification of Jerusalem. So when first century Jews talk about the New Jerusalem, that's what's going on in their mind is that covenant between God and Israel.
Totally.
Right.
Because in their mind, how else are the nations going to be healed?
Right.
Is God done with the Gentiles because they turned to idols? Like, there's no other way. Right. You can't just heal the earth and it heals the families. Like, there's some practicals involved. Yeah. You got to disciple them.
Right.
Yeah. You got to teach them in the ways of God. And so it's sometimes it's awkwardly geographic, and sometimes it's just awkwardly I heard a Jewish guy comment one time that the standard Christian narrative is, even where it kind of overlaps with the Jewish narrative, is far too supernatural for the Jew. Like, it's awkwardly natural. It's awkwardly human and earthly when you read it. Like, the process of actually traveling to the Middle East and learning and then going back and having to figure out how to disseminate information and execute. Yeah. Like, it's just awkwardly not heavenly.
Totally. Well, the Bible's just not supernatural. It's just not ever said. Ever. The word.
Yes, exactly. So. His words, not mine.
Yep.
Yeah, and so, Isaiah 65 ends up getting picked up quite a bit in apocalyptic literature. Like we've talked about the similitudes in, 1 Enoch 45, which we've probably read 20 times on the show. But on that day, I shall cause my elect one to dwell among them. I shall transform the heavens and make it a blessing of light forever. I'll transform also the earth and make it a blessing and cause my elect one to dwell in her. So the language of the new heavens and new earth is kind of presumed in the messianism that is that's projected there. But even more to the point is the apocalypse of weeks, which I don't think we've talked about on the show. And so in First Enoch, the conclusion, the last verses of the apocalypse of the weeks, it says, "Then after this matter, on the 10th week, in the 7th part, there shall be the eternal judgment, and it shall be executed by the angels of the eternal heaven. The great judgment which emanates from all of the angels. The first heaven shall depart and pass away. A new heaven shall appear, and all the powers of the heavens shall shine forever sevenfold. Then after that, there shall be many weeks without number forever, and it shall be a time of goodness and righteousness, and sin shall no more be heard of forever. And so again, you get this kind of echoing of the corruption versus incorruption. In the new heavens and new earth, there will be no more sin. It will be glory, the purging of the heavens. So, it's the language of, it's a little bit different language from 2 Peter 3, but it's the same idea. It's the new heavens and new earth, the home of righteousness that really develops out of, centered around the New Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's good. Another passage comes to mind is, I was looking at earlier, is from the start of the book of Jubilees. So if you're familiar with Jubilees, it's going to basically break down Jewish history in terms of Jubilee years and Jubilee cycles. But it basically gives what is in that period assumed to be just like the standard narrative of history. And he kind of gives it as the explanation for the whole book. And it's like, why did we lose?
The first chapter of Jubilees is just awesome.
Yeah,
it's just
true.
awesome.
And it just explains their frame of mind. Like he's just explaining, this is what we all understand. And so let me tell you how I see history breaking down because of that, being broken down. But so Jubilees 129 says, the angel of the presence who went before the camp of Israel took the tablets of the division of years from the time of the creation of the law and testimony according to their weeks of years, according to the Jubilees, year by year throughout the full number of Jubilees, from the day of creation until the day of new creation, when the heaven and the earth and all of their creatures will be renewed according to the powers of heaven and according to the whole nature of earth, until the sanctuary of the Lord is created in Jerusalem upon Mount Zion. Man. So a few things to note, So number one, this is the introduction. This is not like a teaching point. Like this is the introduction. So we all know these things to be true. So I'm going to write about how these years are broken down. But the way he describes it, from creation until new creation, till the heavens and the earth and their creatures are renewed. And then What's radical is that he sees the sanctuary of the Lord being created in Jerusalem on Mount Zion as happening in the new heavens and the new earth. It's an apocalyptic event. And so he's like writing this Jubilee cycle narrative in context to these things that everybody just assumes is the story of history.
Yeah.
Like we all know this. This is where history's going. New heavens, new earth, a new Jerusalem on Mount Zion.
Yeah, and so much of that is really pulled out of, the Isaianic language of Isaiah 2.
Yeah.
And the raising up of Mount Zion, the house of the Lord on Mount Zion, in light of the day of the Lord and the new heavens and new earth. You have so many themes that get drawn out there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and there's a couple of New Testament passages, guys, that I think, we mentioned this already, Revelation chapter 21, and you mentioned this briefly just a few minutes ago as well, John, 2 Peter 3, that use this language right from Isaiah of new heavens and a new earth. And we often read these passages so disconnected from Jerusalem, the restoration of Jerusalem, the maintenance of the covenant, right? So 2 Peter 3, we're waiting for and hastening the coming day of God. The heavens are going to be set on fire. The heavenly bodies will melt. And so we kind of bring the Greek narrative into this passage where it says there's going to be a new heavens and a new earth, but we bring the Greek narrative into this passage and go, oh, well, God's going to Death Star the earth. And then, we're just going to float away to this immaterial destiny. It's all going to melt and burn. But this is not what Peter, a Jew, would have had in mind when this idea of new heavens and a new earth is being talked about, right? So same thing with John in Revelation 21. Revelation 21, verse 1 and 2, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And again, we often think of these passages, because we're so disconnected disconnected from the idea of God maintaining his covenant with Israel and redemption, having a postal code and all of these ideas that we've been talking about, that we go, oh, so there's this big, massive floating city it's a big cube that's just floating above the earth, or it's in another dimension or another realm. And even the language of coming down out of heaven and prepared as a bride, we go, oh, it's like a big spaceship, or it's like the whole city's the bride, or I'm the bride. And we throw in all of these ideas that have no connection whatsoever to a covenant that God has made, so much more earthy as opposed to more the Christian perspective, which is so floaty, ethereal, and heavenly, right? So the new heavens and the new earth only comes from the conclusion of the covenant and the glorification of what we're going to begin to talk about next time, the idea of the servant, Israel being God's servant throughout the book of Isaiah on the day of the Lord. Guys, these themes are just so significant and so important.
I don't want to belabor the point, but we should at least note that in visionary experiences, the same guys that see John seeing a literal future event of a city descending from heaven are the same guys that are also envisioning Blackhawks and nuclear bombs filling the book of Revelation. So I don't want to belabor it, but the fact is that visionary language and visionary experience in the scriptures is always telling a story, not giving a direct vision of a future historical event.
Right. So the vision is representing Deuteronomy 28 through 30.
Yes.
Deuteronomy 28 through 30 isn't a reference to Revelation 21. The point is that the covenant lies at the center of Isaiah's prophesying. Like, so when
I know it's weird, but the context of Isaiah 60 is not Revelation 21. I know this is going to be stretching for people.
You're blowing my mind, bro. You are blowing my mind.
That's good. Yeah. Well, listeners, we hope that this has been challenging and encouraging. We hope that you see that this is one continuous story that began in Genesis, is continuing through the prophets and continues throughout the New Testament and even into the book of Revelation. That we're not just kind of playing like, where is Waldo, and finding Jesus in these passages to say, oh, he already accomplished the beautiful redemption and everything's good and the new creation's now and all of that, in some sort of redefined or reimagined narrative. No, like the first century Jew understood these things apocalyptically, pushed forward to their ultimate end in context to the covenant, in context to everything that God had promised, that God wants perpetual human flourishing, as you said on a past episode, Bill. That's where this is going. The means by which he's going to bring that about is through a people descended from Abraham, administered by this people from a very specific location on the earth. How's that going to come to pass? Apocalyptically, in the future, by the hand of God alone, on the day of Christ Jesus. That's where this is going.
Every head bowed, every eye closed.
Maranatha.
I love it. Love it. Well, listeners, jump in with us again next week as we continue our look. We're going to spend a little bit more time in Isaiah. We were debating whether we should or shouldn't. We said, man, we have to. So we are going to go back to some passages in Isaiah talking about the servant song. So join us again next time on the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. God bless and Maranatha.
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 Thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. For more, visit us on our website at apocalypticgospel.com and follow us on Twitter at Apocalyptic Gospel.